Hello, and welcome to the Killing Zone podcast. If you've been here before, welcome back. If this is your first time, welcome. My name is Lindsay, and I like to dive into the strange and unknown. During this podcast, I will tell you stories of murder, deceit, and the macabre. Strap in and get ready for the Killing Zone. This episode is a re-recorded episode of a previous case that I have already covered. I want to make this the best podcast possible for all of my listeners. So, I decided to re-record some past episodes with more gruesome details and better sound quality. On today's episode, we will be discussing the Vampire of Sacramento, also known as Richard Trenton Chase, and how he murdered and drank the blood of his victims. Warning: some of the contents in this podcast are graphic and not suitable for all listeners. Listener discretion is advised. It was the late 1970s in Sacramento, California, when Richard Trenton Chase brutally murdered and drank the blood of at least 6 victims, dubbing him the Vampire of Sacramento. From an incredibly early age, Richard had always been profoundly disturbed. He had a series of powerful delusions that had very fatal consequences. This is the story of Richard Trenton Chase, the Vampire of Sacramento. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, California. Richard was raised in a strict household and was beaten often by his father. When he was a teenager, he became an alcoholic and developed a penchant for killing and mutilating animals. He also enjoyed starting fires. These are all common traits of serial killers in their youth. He also frequently wet the bed. Richard was a very disturbed and unhappy child. Richard was unable to stay in a steady relationship with any girl in high school, having a handful of girlfriends. He was unable to maintain a steady relationship due to his inability to become aroused in the presence of females and being unstable to maintain an erection. During his teenage years, Richard sought consultation from a psychiatrist who told him the root of his problems was due to repressed rage or mental illness. However, Richard did not seek any further treatment after this conclusion was made. Later in his life, it would be determined that he could only achieve arousal and orgasm through violent or disturbed acts, such as killing animals and necrophilia. The habits that Richard had are sometimes called the McDonald Triad. The McDonald Triad is a set of 3 factors, the presence of any 2 of which are considered to be predictive of or associated with violence tendencies, particularly with relation to serial offenses. The triad is linked to cruelty to animals, obsession with fire setting, and bedwetting past a certain age, to the violent behaviors and homicidal behavior. During the early part of his childhood, Richard developed hypochondriasis. Hypochondriasis, or hypochondria, is a condition in which a person is excessively and unduly worried about having a serious illness. Richard feared that his heart would stop beating or that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. He would hold an orange to his head because he believed that vitamin C would be absorbed by his brain via diffusion. He also believed that his cranial bones had become separated and were moving around. When he had this belief, he shaved his head to be able to watch the activity of his cranial bones. Richard was living with his mother, but soon left her house because he believed that she was trying to poison him. At this time, he decided to rent an apartment with friends. Although, those friends always complained about Richard being under the influence of LSD, marijuana, and alcohol. He would walk around the apartment in the nude, even when there was company present. The roommates wanted Richard to move out, but he refused, so they decided to move out instead. Once Richard had the apartment to himself, he began to capture, kill, and disembowel various animals. Then he would devour them raw. He would even mix their organs with Coca-Cola in a blender and drink the mixture. He did this because he believed that this would keep his heart from shrinking. He believed that his heart was going to shrink and disappear entirely, and then he would die. Let us take a break and listen to a word from our sponsor. When we return, we will discuss more of the Vampire of Sacramento. Welcome back, and thank you for listening to a word from our sponsor. At the age of 25, Richard was involuntarily committed into a mental institution after being taken to a hospital for poisoning that he contracted from injecting himself with rabbit's blood. He had escaped from the hospital and ran to his mother's home, but she had him arrested. He was then sent to an institution for the criminally insane. In this institution, he would often tell stories about his fantasies to the staff. His fantasies were all about killing rabbits. The staff there called him Dracula because of his fixation with blood. The staff once found him with blood smeared all over his mouth. He had caught 2 birds through the bars of his window, snapped their necks, and drank their blood. During his time in the institution, Richard was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. At the age of 26, he went through many treatments involving psychotropic drugs, which helped him, and Richard was deemed no longer a danger to society and was released to his mother's custody. His mother decided that Richard no longer needed his medication and weaned him off of it, and eventually got him his own apartment. After this, in mid-1977, Richard was arrested on a reservation located in Pyramid Lake, Nevada. He had blood smeared all over his body, and a bucket of blood had been located in his truck. The blood was determined to be cow's blood, and no charges were filed. When he was in his own apartment again, he also began to capture, torture, and drink the blood of cats, dogs, and rabbits. He even killed and ate his neighbor's pets. After eating his neighbor's pets, he would phone them up and explain what he did. He began to develop a love for firearms, purchasing several guns and practiced firing them obsessively. He also had a fascination with the crimes of the Hillside Strangler. He believed that himself and the Hillside Strangler were both victims of the Nazis and UFO conspiracy. Richard had a belief that everyone was out to kill him. He believed that the Nazis, the FBI, and space aliens and their weapons were located in his bathroom under his soap dish. He felt that there was a secret poisoning that was slowly turning his blood to powder. Richard believed that only fresh blood could save him, and he had no care where it came from. He also began not to take care of himself. He neglected personal hygiene, he didn't bathe, he didn't groom himself, and he did not brush his teeth. He even stopped eating and dropped to a meager weight of 145 pounds. During the year of 1977, Richard rang his mother's doorbell and presented her with her dead cat, thrusting it in her face. In front of his mother, he threw the cat to the ground, knelt down, ripped its stomach open with his hands, put his hands inside the cat and smeared blood all over his face and began to scream. However, his mother did nothing. She just went back inside and did not report the incident to anyone. It was just after Christmas in 1977 when Richard would commit his first murder. On December 29th, Richard killed his first victim in a drive-by shooting. But this murder was just the start to the disturbing and brutal spree of murders he would commit later. His first victim was 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin. Richard shot him while he was assisting his wife bring groceries into their home. Before committing his second murder, Richard began with some disturbing behavior. On January 11, 1978, he asked his neighbor for a cigarette, then attempted to forcibly restrain her until she gave him the entire pack. Just 2 weeks later, he attempted to go into the house of another woman, Luckily, her doors were locked. One thing that Richard told detectives was if a door was locked, it was meant that he was not welcome there, but an unlocked door was an open invitation. That same night, he encountered an old friend from high school and had asked her for a ride, but she was so frightened by his appearance that she declined. Then he attempted to enter more homes. He came across the home of a young married couple who had been out but left their door unlocked. When Richard entered their home, he urinated in their infant's clothing and defecated in their son's bed. The couple arrived home during this act, and the husband attacked Richard, but he escaped during the attack. Just a day later, he came across the home of David and Teresa Wallen. David had been away at work, and Teresa was 3 months pregnant. She had left her door unlocked while she took out the garbage. When she came back in, she saw Richard sitting in her home, and he shot her 3 times. Once in her hand, which was a defensive wound, and then twice in her head, which killed her. What he did next was repulsive. He dragged Teresa into her bedroom and raped her dead, lifeless body while he stabbed her with a butcher knife. When he was done defiling her body, he carved open her corpse, removed several of her organs, used a bucket to collect her blood, then went to the bathroom and poured the blood in the bathtub and began to bathe in it. He then sliced off her nipple and drank her blood. He used an empty yogurt container as a cup. He then went out to the backyard and found a pile of dog feces and stuffed it in her mouth and throat. Since David was a truck driver, her body would not be discovered until 2 days later when David returned home. On the same day that Teresa's body was discovered, Richard purchased 2 puppies from his neighbor, then killed them and drank their blood. He then proceeded to place those dead puppies on her front lawn. It would be January 27th when Richard would commit his final act. This time, it would be a mass murder. On this day, Richard entered the residence of Evelyn Myroth. She was 38. In her home, she was with her 6-year-old son, Jason, her 1-year-old nephew, David, and her neighbor, Dan Meredith, who had come over to keep an eye on the kids while Evelyn was in the bath. When Richard entered the home, Dan stepped into the hallway to see who was coming in. He was shot in the head at a point-blank range. He died instantly. Once Dan was dead, Richard took his wallet and car keys from his pocket. Richard would then continue his spree, shooting Jason and David. Once they were dead, he entered Evelyn's room and shot her once in the head. He then took her body onto the bed and sodomized it. He had begun to slice the back of her neck and drink her blood from those cuts. In her autopsy report, the medical examiner noted that there was an inordinate amount of semen in the rectum of the corpse, indicating an unusual amount of ejaculations. After he was done with the necrophiliac ways, he stabbed Evelyn's body 6 times in her anus. He used so much force with the knife that it penetrated her uterus. He stabbed her in a series of vital points on the body. This caused the blood from her internal organs to pool into her abdomen. Then he sliced her open and drained her blood into a bucket and consumed it all. He then went to the body of David and split his skull open in the bathtub and consumed of the brain. Before Richard could do anything else to the other 2 bodies, a girl who was coming by for a play date with Jason knocked on the front door. This startled Richard. He took the body of David and stole Dan's car, fleeing from the home. The girl alerted a neighbor who broke into the home and discovered the bodies of Jason, Dan, and Evelyn. The neighbor contacted the police. The police discovered that Richard had left perfect handprints and shoe imprints in Evelyn's blood. Richard was found at his home without David's body. He had chopped off the penis and used it as a straw to suck the blood from the body. He also removed and consumed several organs, making smoothies out of some. He disposed of the body at a nearby church. When the police entered his apartment, they found blood on the walls, floor, ceiling, fridge, and all over his dishes and drinking glasses. Let's listen to one more word from our sponsor, and when we get back, we'll discuss the fate of Richard Trenton Chase. Welcome back, and thank you once again for listening to a word from our sponsor. After the murder of Teresa Wallen, there was 2 FBI agents assigned to investigate, Russ Vergel and Robert Wessler. They spent much time compiling a profile of the killer. They determined that he would be tall, malnourished, a loner, unclean, and that he would continue to kill. It would be 5 days after the mass murder that Nancy Holden would reach out to police and inform them that she believed Richard could be the killer. The police immediately ran a background check on Richard and determined that his gun matched the bullets left at the mass murder. Those belonging to a .22 caliber semi-automatic pistol, registered under Richard's name and being the same gun that Richard owned. Both FBI detectives and the police went to Richard's apartment and asked to speak with him, but he refused. They did not have a warrant and could not do anything about getting into his home without one, so they hid down the hall and waited for him to leave his apartment. When Richard left, he was carrying a blood-stained box, and his coat and shoes were also stained with blood. This gave the detectives and police motive to arrest him. In the box, they found his gun, which he would use to commit the murders, and shredded pieces of blood-soaked wallpaper. When Richard was questioned about the contents of the box, he claimed that it was because he was killing dogs inside his apartment. When police searched Richard, they found Dan Meredith's wallet in his pocket. It was at this time they were able to search his apartment. As mentioned before, his walls, floor, ceiling, fridge, and dishes were soaked in blood. The scene looked like a slaughterhouse. But what detectives uncovered in his fridge and on his blender were pure carnage. The blender had been used so much to make blood smoothies that it was caked with coagulated blood and rotting pieces of internal organs. In the fridge, they found several animal body parts wrapped in tinfoil. 1-year-old David's brains were in a Tupperware container, and pieces of his body were wrapped in saran wrap. They also found the internal organs of Evelyn Myroth and Teresa Wallen. On his kitchen table laid several pet collars and diagrams of human biology. Richard stood trial for 6 counts of murder in 1979. His defense team wanted him to avoid the death penalty, so they tried to use his history of mental illness to get him charged with second-degree murder. They said that his acts were not premeditated because he had lack of planning. This defense, however, was not successful. On May 8, 1979, Richard Trenton Chase pled guilty to 6 counts of first-degree murder. The judge found Richard not legally insane. He was sentenced to the death penalty via the gas chamber. While he sat in prison awaiting his death, Richard feared being in prison. He had a fear that many of the guards inside the prison were Nazis and that they were out to kill him by the macaroni and cheese that he was served at dinner. So he would often stuff this in his pocket and try to use it as proof that the Nazis were going to kill him. Many of the inmates feared him for the acts that he had committed, that they tried to convince him to commit suicide. Richard claimed in many interviews that it was not his fault. He said that he was forced to kill to stay alive because he believed that Nazi UFOs and Nazis were responsible for poisoning him. He demanded that the Nazis stand trial for the murders he had committed. Richard never made it to the gas chamber. He instead took his own life on December 26, 1980, by overdosing on antidepressants that were prescribed to him by the prison doctor. Never leave your door unlocked. You could end up the prey to another sadistic maniac like the Vampire of Sacramento. Even though he's no longer in this world and took his own life, you may never know what lurks around the corner, waiting for you to leave your home unprotected so they can get in and make their attack. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I hope you return to listen to the next episode of The Killing Zone. This is Lindsay signing off. Stay healthy and stay happy, killers.